They don't have an army. They don't hold elections. Most people don't even know who leads them. Yet almost every country on Earth answers to them in moments of crisis. Not the United Nations. Not NATO. Not the World Bank. This organization quietly influences interest rates, national budgets, fuel prices, pensions, food subsidies, and even whether governments survive political unrest. When it enters a country, protests often follow. When it leaves, nations are never the same. Here's the mystery. If this organization exists to help countries, why do so many people fear it? Why do nations beg for its support, then regret it years later? And why does its power seem to grow every time the world falls into chaos? To understand how one organization came to influence 190 countries, we have to go back to a moment when the global financial system nearly collapsed and powerful nations decided never to lose control again. After World War II, the world was shattered. Entire economies were destroyed, currencies were unstable, and countries were drowning in debt. The fear wasn't just poverty, it was chaos. Leaders worried that economic collapse would lead to political extremism, revolutions, and another global war. In 1944, representatives from 44 countries met in a quiet town in New Hampshire. Officially, the goal was stability. Unofficially, it was control. They wanted a system where currencies wouldn't collapse overnight, where governments couldn't act recklessly, and where financial power would flow through predictable channels. From this meeting emerged a new financial architecture. At its center was an institution designed to act like a global emergency room for countries in trouble. If your economy collapsed, it would lend you money. If your currency failed, it would step in. If investors fled, it would restore confidence. But there was a condition, one that would define the next 80 years. This organization wouldn't just lend money. It would reshape economies. At first, its role seemed limited and technical. It monitored exchange rates, provided short-term loans, and offered economic advice. In the early decades, its power was subtle. Then the world changed. In the 1970s, oil shocks hit the global economy. Energy prices exploded. Inflation surged. Developing countries borrowed heavily to survive. By the early 1980s, many of them couldn't repay their debts. That's when this organization truly rose to power. Suddenly, dozens of countries were desperate. And desperation shifts power. The organization began offering large rescue packages, but only if governments agreed to strict conditions. These conditions became known as structural adjustments. Governments were told to cut public spending. Subsidies for food and fuel were removed. Public companies were privatized. Currencies were devalued. Taxes were restructured. The logic sounded clean and mathematical. Reduce deficits, restore investor confidence, and growth will follow. But the reality was far messier. In country after country, these policies triggered immediate pain. Prices rose overnight. Wages stagnated, public services collapsed, middle classes shrank. In some places, riots erupted within weeks of the reforms. Supporters argued this pain was necessary short-term suffering for long-term stability. Critics argued something darker, that the organization was enforcing a one-size-fits-all ideology, regardless of local realities. Yet governments kept returning. Why? Because once a country accepted its first rescue package, it often became trapped. New loans were needed to repay old ones. Economic policies became permanently monitored. Domestic decisions increasingly required external approval. By the 1990s, the organization's influence extended far beyond crisis lending. It now shaped development strategies, labor markets, pension systems, and even healthcare models. Then came the breaking point. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 exposed deep flaws. Fast-growing economies suddenly collapsed as capital fled overnight. The organization stepped in with massive bailout programs, but the conditions were severe. Countries that had once been praised as success stories experienced economic freefall. Unemployment soared. Entire industries vanished. And something unexpected happened. Countries began to recover faster when they stopped following the prescribed fixes. This triggered a global backlash. Former supporters turned critics. Economists inside the system admitted mistakes. Internal reports quietly acknowledged that some policies worsened inequality and slowed recovery. But the organization didn't disappear. Instead, it adapted. After the 2008 global financial crisis, ironically caused by wealthy nations, the same organization that had imposed Austerity on poorer countries became a lifeline for advanced economies. Trillions were mobilized. Conditions softened. The rules seemed flexible. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. Why were strict conditions enforced on weak countries but relaxed for powerful ones? The answer lies in how the organization is structured. Voting power isn't equal. It's based on financial contributions. A small group of wealthy nations effectively controls decision-making, leadership selection, and policy direction. Which brings us to today. As of now, nearly 190 countries are members. Many still depend on its approval to access global credit markets. A negative assessment can trigger capital flight, currency collapse, and political instability. In recent years, the organization has spoken the language of reform. It now acknowledges inequality. It warns about climate risk. It talks about social protection. But the underlying pattern remains unchanged. Debt crises are rising again. Developing nations are spending more on interest payments than on healthcare or education. Emergency loans are increasing. And the same cycle: crisis, conditions, compliance is repeating. History doesn't repeat exactly, but financial systems run. Today's debt traps echo the 1980s. Today's inflation shocks echo the 1970s. Today's global instability mirrors the post-war fears that created this organization in the first place. So what does this all mean? First takeaway: economic power doesn't need soldiers. Control over liquidity, credit, and confidence can influence governments more effectively than force. Second takeaway: crisis centralizes authority. Every global shock expands the reach of institutions designed to manage emergencies and shrinks the space for national choice. Third takeaway: systems built for stability can quietly undermine sovereignty. When survival depends on approval, independence becomes conditional. The unanswered question is this: as the world enters an era of rising debt, climate shocks, and financial fragmentation, will this organization finally reform its core logic? Or will it become even more powerful? Because the next crisis is not a matter of if only when. And when it comes, nearly every country will knock on the same door. If you want to understand how global power really works beyond headlines, elections, and speeches, this is where the story begins. If this video made you see the world differently, subscribe for more deep dive stories on hidden systems shaping our future. Because the most important forces are often the ones we're told not to notice.